There we go.
Oop.
So are you seeing a slide that says Episcopal 101?
Yes,
Or are you seeing two slides?
just one.
Oh, good. Been a while since I've done this in this way from home. So yeah, learning our stories. I'm big on stories. You probably all pick that up at some point or another. So that's kind of my subtitle. And tonight, and we'll go through kind of what the overlay of the period, the series will be. So be some introductions, and then we'll start moving where we begin is history, and everything else will sort of feed off of that. So what I'd like to do this evening, and is
That.
Are you both
is
here?
Yes, well, one's in
Fine.
black. Sorry.
that's okay. Talk about who's in the room, our virtual room here, and then sort of an overview of what we'll be doing, and we'll talk about language, and I don't mean foul language or anything like that, but this is where the video comes in, because there are some things that you'll say, oh, right, I understand now why we're talking about that. And then we'll start in on history and where Anglicanism, sort of the roots of Anglicanism or the origins of Anglicanism. So what I'd like to do first is just, what's your story? You know, I don't think everybody who's on the screen knows everybody else who's here. What's your background? And that could be, you know, your religious background, you know, your educational stuff, what you've done, anything that, and then what your knowledge level is. You may, some people have grown up Episcopalian and forgotten everything, so their knowledge level is somewhat hidden. Other people have come in from other backgrounds, and so they don't know much of anything about Anglicanism. And then do you have specific interests? You know, whether it's history or theology or how we do, why we do what we do, or, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So right now there are only 3 of you. That's fine. Thank you for joining in on this. So I don't care who starts, and I'm not going to point figures. So somebody just jump in, and then we'll just let it sort of flow organically.
Well, I can start if you want me to.
Please.
My name is Marilyn Taylor. I have been going to Good Shepherd for about 4 years. Is that how long you've been there, Gary?
Yeah, four
Okay,
and a bit.
I came right after you did.
Yeah.
My background is I was raised Catholic, and when we moved to Denver, I just wasn't happy with the Catholic Church and some of their teachings. So I decided that my friends, when I was going to in high school and college, were Episcopal. So I thought, well, I'd try that church. So anyway, I came to Good Shepherd, and no, this was in the 70s. I found a church up on University, and so I went there. That was the closest one at the time. And I was confirmed up there in the late 70s. And then trying to think, I got divorced, and I was teaching, and it just was sometimes very difficult for me to get to church on Sunday. So I didn't go to church for about 18 years, which I feel bad about. But then I came back to Good Shepherd, and I love it. The people are wonderful. The priest is wonderful. The music is wonderful. My knowledge level, that's why I'm doing this again. I want to learn more. The history I'm pretty good with, but just some of the practices and the traditions and the rituals, I'd like to learn more about that. So,
Was the church that you went to on university, was that Christ Church, or was it
yes,
St. Michael Angels?
that was Christ Church.
Okay, just curious.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Thanks.
Okay, my name is Jenna Kraft, and my background is Presbyterian. I was a Presbyterian member until I went to college, and then I really didn't go anywhere. And one of the reasons is that I felt like the people in the church in Kentucky, where I lived at the time, were hypocritical. I mean, we learned how you should behave as a Christian, but what I saw is people not behaving that way. And it just kind of discouraged me. So I went on a search basically for religion, and I studied Buddhism. I studied with the Church of Religious Science. Then I became a member of the Latter-day Saints, and then I became inactive with that group. I just felt like it wasn't the place for me. And Marilyn invited me. She told me that at Good Shepherd, they were looking for choir members and people to ring the bells. So that's why I started coming. And that was, I guess, almost a year and a half ago. But what I've learned is that I want to be a part of that church. The kindness of people, the size of the church is very it's very good for me. It's not huge. As far as what I know about Episcopal Church is, I read the book about last summer, and I learned a little bit, but I need to really study it more. And my interests basically are singing and ringing and any kind of music. So that's me.
So worship oriented stuff.
Worship
When you say singing and ringing, I'm thinking about where all of that sort of shows up in churches is in worship. So things that have to do
Right.
with
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's,
Okay.
I enjoy
Okay.
singing in the choir in the worship service.
Yeah.
I mean,
Cool.
That's a big part of my life.
Okay. Cool.
Mhm.
Sandy,
Well,
it's up to you.
It's up to me. Hi, I'm Sandy. I'm a Castro Price. I first started when I was very young. I was Catholic. And then my mom kind of took over the religion, and she was Pentecostal. And it was just back and forth. It was very confusing between Catholicism and Pentecostal. But then I kind of for many years switched to some non-denominational, bigger churches, and just got kind of discouraged. And then Tom and I got married 10 years ago, and then we started going to St. Tim's. Then we moved closer to Greenwood Village because we were living in Littleton. We moved to Greenwood Village, and I just happened to drive by Good Shepherd, and I always felt at home. I started going when Craig was there, took a little break, came back when Gary was, and it just always felt like home. And I'm in the discernment process of the orders of the King with Good Shepherd. So I just want to continue to really put the background of, the Episcopal Church, because I haven't studied school, for religion for a while. And then I worked for the Methodist Church, but that's an offset. And I just, I feel at home, and I tried to do this a couple months ago, but it didn't happen. But here I am. I did morning sheep count when the pandemic hit. So that's my life.
Mhm.
Yeah, well, good. I'll just bop in here for a second in terms of, many of you have heard some of my background, but maybe not. Jenna, you probably would be the least likely to have heard it, because sometimes it comes out in sermons. And so I've had 4 years of telling the congregation what's been going on, and you haven't heard all that 4-year stuff.
Right.
But I did not grow up Episcopalian. I grew up sort of German Baptist, Anabaptist, Peace Church, pacifist background, and came to the Episcopal Church, was introduced to the Episcopal Church when I was in college. And my tie to that was my music teacher in college said, if you want to do church music, you need to go to the Episcopal Church because they do it better than anybody else.
Mm.
And he was not Episcopalian, but he appreciated that. And so I went to the local Episcopal church, and that was kind of, all she wrote. It took me a few years to actually cross over. So I was confirmed in, I think, 1979. I think that's about right. No, about 1979 or 1980. And so it's been a while. And my interest areas have, always been sort of worship and then history. And the thing that drew me to, one of the things that drew me to the Episcopal Church, other than the music itself, was just the drama. The vestments, all of the senses are sort of engaged, especially if you go to a church where they use incense. So you taste and sound and touch and body moving up and down, and then maybe incense, so you got the smell. So I'm a historian. That's my academic training. So the history stuff and the liturgy stuff are the things that I'm really most interested in, and that often comes out in other ways that you may have seen. So that's who's here, and that's great. We've got a lot of different backgrounds and experiences, and so bring questions that come out of those experiences to our conversations, and it will be fun. So let's see, here we go. Boom. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to start this evening with just the introductions, as we've been doing. And then we'll start with Anglican history, and depending on how fast we go, how many questions you have, how many tangents I take, I'll try not to take too many. We should at least get to the Reformation. And if we go more quickly, we might get to the point where we can focus on the Episcopal Church. In other words, the Revolutionary War. But we'll see. Last year when I did this, we made it to the Reformation. And so week 2, we started with the Reformation and then worked our way through. So we'll spend 2 weeks on history, this week and next week. And then the following week, we'll do worship and spirituality. And by the way, I'll come back to something else in just a minute. And then we'll take a couple week break while we've got the holidays, Christmas and New Year's. And then we'll come back in January and talk about how Episcopalians read the Bible and how we think theologically. You heard me yesterday talk about the Anglican three-legged stool. You'll understand more about what all that is and why that's there when we have that conversation in January. And then we'll end with a conversation about how the church is governed, run, and what are our mission and what do we think about mission. So I don't expect you to retain all of this. There is a syllabus, and I'm going to have to jump out of what I'm sharing here, so that I can show you some other stuff here. Come on. There we go. Yeah, like I said, I'm not accustomed to doing this. So there is a syllabus, and I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. But there is also a drive, a share drive, where I keep documents. So one of the things that we will be doing is you have the book, and the syllabus will show you what chapters to read in the book. It will also say there's a handout. And so the handout, and I'm going to put this in the chat. and the chat feature. And you can go to this and you can see all of the stuff that I would be handing out.
Can we download it then?
Yes.
Not a
So
okay.
if you go to that link, you'll see in the files of that link, and I tested this morning with Natalie to make sure that she could open everything, and she said she could. So if you have any problems, just let me know. But you'll see in there, down at the bottom of the files, there's the 2023 Episcopal 101 syllabus. And that's the one that you would, that you want to go ahead and print, and that tells you what we're doing each time. And then there will be, a link, not a link, but the syllabus will say handout on the beginnings of Anglicanism for maybe next week. And so you could just go ahead and then download that particular file. It's just a copy of an article or a chapter from a different book. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Well, it all makes sense, except where do we find the file?
It's in the Google Drive.
Yeah, did you
Google
see
Drive.
did you see the thing come through on the chat with the Google Drive link?
Go to the chat, Jenna.
Go to
Yeah,
the
then-
chat? I don't
Yeah,
even
go to
see
the
a
chat.
Where is the chat?
Okay, so down at the bottom of your screen, where it says, you'll see
Good
a lot
Shepherd.
of things. Down at the bottom of your screen where it's got all of the control, maybe it's on the side, I don't know what you're using, where you have all the controls for Zoom.
Oh, I see it now. Okay.
Yeah, so if you click on
Which-
chat, it'll open up another window, and up at the top, you'll see a link.
Oh, where it says share content. Okay. Stop, mute, more.
So I can also
Oh,
email
see
this
chat.
out.
Yes. Okay. Got it.
Okay, so that's where all of those files are.
Thank you.
Sure. No, it's just, this is kind of how we do it, without actually doing handouts, right? And this way, if you don't want a piece of paper and you just want to read it on a screen, you can do it that way too. The other thing that we will do is on Sunday, the 8th of January, there will be a faith forum where Larry Hitt, member of the congregation, he's also the chancellor for the diocese and has been going to our national church's general conventions for a long time. He and Bishop Epting, who of course has gone to a lot of conventions, including Lambeth, and Jim Wolfe, and maybe Cal Schofield, I've heard back from him on this, are going to do a faith forum on conventions in Lambeth and just talk about what it's like to go to these things. We will talk about those in terms of governance at the end, but this was the week that Larry was in town. So, and they all want to talk about it, not just for y'all, but for anybody who's interested in what goes on at General Convention and why should we care? We people at this little church in the Diocese of Colorado, why should we care what goes on at the national level? Or why should we really care what bishops from around the world are discussing at Lambeth Palace in England? So that's what they're going to talk about. So there's another little thing that we've never done before, but it just happened that, we had General Convention, Diocesan Convention in Lambeth all in the same year. And I thought, well, this gives us an opportunity that we should take advantage of. So if you have problems accessing any of those documents, let me know and I can get them to you another way, but just let me know that that's a problem. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now I'm going to go back, try again, go back and share screen. I don't know why this is so hard. It never used to be this hard. There we go. So we're back at the screen that says overview of the class.
Mhm.
Okay, all right. So now we're going to get the teeny little video and you'll understand why I was talking about language.
Every so often, I get the following question asked to me. What is the difference between an Anglican and an Episcopalian? And sometimes I roll pie back by asking the following question. What is the difference between a car and an automobile? The answer, of course, is there isn't, as those two words are synonyms and mean the same thing. So, what is the difference between an Anglican and an Episcopalian? Not too much, except an explanation of why they're calling themselves different words. Well, it all starts in the 17th century in Scotland. Yes, Scotland. The Anglicanism found in England had been introduced there when the kings of Scotland had also become the kings of England. However, in the 17th century, Anglicanism wasn't called Anglicanism yet, at least not in English. Eventually, these Scottish Anglicans needed a way to contrast themselves from their fellow Scottish Protestants, whose church was governed by elders and as such were called Presbyterians. As the Scottish Anglicans used bishops for church governance, they used the term Episcopalians. Fast forward to the end of the 18th century and the American War of Independence, and a similar situation arises. Those Americans who still had the core tenets and beliefs of the Church of England and wanted to contrast themselves with the other Protestants in their country had to find a name for themselves that didn't imply a connection to the nation they had just fought and won independence from. In short, they took a page from the Scots and named their church the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. Finally, at the beginning of the 19th century, someone thought it was a good idea to come up with an English word to describe the people that had a common doctrine that originated from the Church of England, or Ecclesiae Anglicana, as it was called in Latin. The word Anglican was derived from the Latin word Anglicania, and luckily it stuck. Thus, the vast majority of the world's Anglicans call themselves Anglicans, while a minority call themselves Episcopalians.
Okay,
That makes sense?
That was
that
good.
does.
Okay. There is another distinction that I'll try and remember to bring up later on, that is the product of the last 25, 30 years in the United States, where some folks who used to be Episcopalians don't want to call themselves Episcopalians anymore and want to call themselves Anglicans. So they want to disassociate themselves with the Episcopal Church for a variety of reasons, and we'll get to that. And so they want to maintain their ties to the way that Anglicans think and believe and worship. And so they call themselves Anglicans. So right down the street from my house. So like I say, I live over by Cherry Creek State Park. So very close to the corner of Bellevue and Dayton, right by Cherry Creek High School, there is a church that's called Resurrection Anglican Fellowship. And we'll talk more about that as we go on further down the road. But they are not Episcopalians in the sense that they do not go to our diocesan convention or things like that. They have become their own body. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. So, but yeah, the other thing that didn't come out in the little video, and this is confusing, is we are Episcopalians. We're not Episcopals. We are Episcopalians, but we attend an Episcopal church. So it's yeah, it's just one of those weird ways that English works. And it doesn't work that way for Presbyterians. You're a Presbyterian and you go to a Presbyterian church. You're Catholics and you go to a Catholic church. But the way that it's worked its way through in English with the Episcopal Church is it's the Episcopal Church, it's the Episcopal Diocese of Colorado, and we who do all of those things are Episcopalians. Okay, so people confuse those all the time, and that's all right. It's just the nature of the beast. So what I propose to do for the rest of the evening is talk about how the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Church got going. And if I were to ask a room full of people, how did the Church of England get its start? A huge number of folks in the room would say it's because Henry wanted to get a divorce. And and there is a little bit of truth to that, but that's way too simple. You know, that misses a whole lot of stuff. So we're going to go all the way back to the beginning and walk through 1,500 years of history in the next hour. Okay. So,
All right.
you know, the readings in the book and then in the handout will elaborate on some of this. And I have picked things to emphasize or to mention as we go through. Some of them are because they may have to do with individuals that you'll see a church named after. And so, oh, why is this church named Saint so-and-so's? Well, I've picked some of those things. Some of them are because of their historical events, kind of larger than Anglicanism, kind of world events. And where did they fit? And you'll say, oh gosh, I never really knew where the Battle of Hastings fit in terms of church history or these kinds of things. So, so there are some tidbits in here that may not show up in some of the readings that are kind of, you know, I just think add a little bit more flavor to the conversation. So it all, of course, starts with Jesus, who died and rose in around 30 AD, or in the Common Era CE. Most people now will not use AD, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord, because recognize a lot of people don't have a Lord that it's in the year of. And so it ends up being called Common Era, and before the Common Era, when everybody was using the same calendar. So anyway, Jesus died, and the mission of the church began in earnest, and it spread around the Mediterranean very quickly. And so by the time the Roman legions moved into Britain in 44, Christians were already in the troops. And so Christianity got introduced to Britain in about 44, when Rome went in to conquer Britain. Now, that didn't mean that there was a whole lot of Christianity going on, but certainly there were Christians. And so at the beginning of the 3rd century, in 209, Alban, and that's who the icon there is, Saint Alban, and you see proto-martyr of England. So he was the first Christian martyr in England, and he was executed. He was a Roman soldier who offered shelter to a Christian missionary from Gaul, from France. So he offered this to that person, offered sanctuary to that person. And for that, he was killed. And there are St. Alban's churches all over. So that's, he was sort of the kind of the first of many martyrs in England. We'll run across more as we go through this. Did I hear somebody want to ask a question? Please interrupt me if you want to ask a question. And I'm going to see if I can move my screen that has my pictures on it to the screen that I'm looking at so that I can actually see you. There we go. So that was in 209. Christianity spread through Britain little by little. And it made it a whole lot easier when Constantine declared Christianity legal, or the religion of the empire. And so it was okay to be a Christian at that point. And so those that were underground sort of, came up. In 314, so just 2 years later, there was a council in Gaul in the town of Arles, and I don't remember what the council was all about, but we know that Britain sent 3 bishops, a priest and a deacon. So by the beginning of the 4th century, there were enough Christians in Britain that they had bishops, priests, and a deacon, and they had those folks, and they knew each other around around Europe, that they knew about this council and went. So, like I say, I don't remember what was really important at that council, but for our purposes, what was important is that Christianity had become enough of a thing in Britain that that Britain was able to send folks to the council to represent the British Church at that point. 325, the first ecumenical council. So this was in Nicaea, or now it's called Iznik in Asia Minor. A council that was really there debating all sorts of things, from the date of Easter to whether you should kneel during Lent. All sorts of things were under debate at the Council of Nicaea. One of the stories is, and this is very appropriate because we'll celebrate him tomorrow, is that Nicholas of Myra, the Asia Minor, Saint Nicholas, was at this council, and there's a story that he was in a group of folks that were debating the theological, I forget exactly what controversy, and the story that was related is that he slapped one of his opponents, and he slapped a heretic. So a lot of time you may see on Facebook, if you're on Facebook, you may see something up about, hey, it's St. Nicholas Day, go slap a heretic. And but anyway, that St. Nicholas is, of course, the one that became the progenitor of Santa Claus. But there were probably British at this council, but this council was the one that came up with the Nicene Creed, and we'll talk about that a little later on. And we do know that the decisions that council made were accepted in Britain. So again, Britain was, even though it was way off from where the centers of Christianity were, whether Rome or Constantinople, even though it was way off from there, there was enough going on, enough movement through the empire, that Christianity in Britain sort of understood what was going on elsewhere. Few decades later, the Anglo-Saxon pagans came into Britain and conquered and occupied Britain. They were the Britons were relatively passive, didn't put up much of a fight against the Germans and the Scandinavians. Wales did not get conquered, and so it remained Christian. It didn't sort of revert to sort of paganism. And one of the things that is important about what the Anglo-Saxons came in and did is that they changed kind of the culture of Britain, where there was this huge emphasis on courage and hard works, this sort of do it, you can do it, and just sort of stand up and do it. And we'll see that as we go through some later theological developments. But basically up through around 400, that's how Christianity got into Britain and started to spread. So any questions? I mean, we're going to run through history here. And so if you don't like history, this can be a slog. So don't want to make it an entire slog. So let me know if you've got any questions.
So the Christians, before the Anglo-Saxon pagans came, enough of them were able to continue the faith that it didn't die?
No. The Anglo-Saxons, obviously, given the representation that they had at the Council of Arles and possibly at the Council of Nicaea, there was a thriving church.
Okay.
that the Anglo-Saxons didn't wipe out. I don't, they didn't really fight. I think that I'm not a expert on that period of English history, but it sounds to me like they just kind of came in and took over, and the Britons said, "Oh, that's fine. Just let us do what we want to do." But there
Oh.
was not, from what I understand, no imposition of sort of pagan stuff. It's just that now the rulers of at least England, excluding Wales, the rulers were pagan.
Gotcha.
So come on, there we go. In 400, there was a Roman trained bishop of Galloway in Britain, started evangelizing the Picts. So these are some of those Anglo-Saxon and kind of the native folks. So he started evangelizing other groups. So there was this real effort to do it. And Ninian is known as Saint Ninian for his evangelism works. So in 410, so there's a lot going on in Britain, okay, and that's kind of what we're talking about here. In 410, there was a British Christian thinker by the name of Pelagius, and whereas he thought that the way that Christianity being portrayed, especially as it had gotten assumed by this Anglo-Saxon culture of hard work, you're going to get there, he thought that the way that Christianity had been portrayed by the Romans was everything's grace and it's all okay and you can live any way you want because grace is going to save you. And he picked up on kind of where these Anglo-Saxons came and said, no, you got to do something. And so he really stressed, hard work. He denied that there was original sin. And he eventually became declared a heretic. But his thinking really infused the British Church, and so there, even in Anglicanism today, you'll hear a lot that we actually have to do something. It's not just all about grace. It's not just wishy-washy stuff. We actually have to do something, and it's called semi-Pelagianism, and that started with this guy and is found in a lot of different aspects of the church, but part of the Episcopal Church, is part of our heritage. Not to say that we don't believe in grace or any of that other sort of stuff, but there is the sense of that material having to do things. In the 430s, Patrick, I think you've heard of him, trotted across the water to Ireland. He was from an ecclesiastical or a clerical family in Britain. And he was an escaped Irish slave, so he went back to Ireland as a bishop, and he organized, evangelized, helped the poor, confronted the Druids, and drove all the snakes out of Ireland. If we if we want to believe that story, right? So what went into Ireland was English Christianity. Well, one of the debates that was raised back at the Council of Nicaea, and it was theoretically settled there, was when is Easter? So even though the church in Europe was, which kind of included Britain, it moved in its own way, but Britain kind of kept its own kind of patterns. And so while the Nicaea declared when Easter would be, Britain celebrated it on a different day. And so who's going to win in terms of defining the date of Easter? And so Leo the Great, who was Pope at that point, he changed the method of calculating the date of Easter. Why? So Easter wouldn't fall, or so that Good Friday, 2 days before Easter, would never fall on a particular day, kind of like Super Bowl Friday, on this huge sports day in Rome. So he recalculated it so that it would never coincide with that day. And so it was always on a Sunday. You could think if you wanted to go back, you could kind of calculate even the day of the year that Jesus might have been crucified, given what year and when Passover fell. You could almost calculate the date, the exact day, and say, well, it's always going to be on this day, March 31st. Or you could say that it's always going to be related to when Passover was, because Passover moves. And so they went through, and Leo came up with this scheme for calculating Easter. And we'll see how that was resolved in the next slide. So we've got these two different Easters going on. The Easter that's going on in Britain, and then it's Easter that's really sort of Roman Catholic. 500, the Tintagel, the first Celtic monastery. So now we're starting to see monastic orders. Monasticism didn't develop in Rome until the 4th century, and it spread from there. Benedict and all of those folks. But monasticism started in Britain differently. It wasn't Benedictine, it was its own kind of thing. And so again, we've got Britain developing a little bit different than the rest of the Roman Catholic world. So Tintagel, or Tintagel, was the very first of these Celtic monasteries. 530, Saint David went to Wales and started the conversion of the Welsh people. He was known as the water drinking bishop. He didn't drink anything other than water. No wine, no beer, just water. But he popularized Christianity in Wales. So in Welsh Christian circles, St. David's Day is still a big deal. And you will see that. And sometimes you'll see churches, St. David of Wales. Again, there's one of those folks that include, because you might run across churches. Certainly, you don't see too many St. Patrick's Episcopal churches, but there are some. And then in 562, Columba, an Irishman, took Christianity to Scotland. So this is all beginning to weave across all of those isles, the British Isles, including Ireland. Things are going from one place to another. One of the legends about Columba was that he blessed Loch Ness to get rid of the monster.
Yeah.
So, all of those congregations that were founded by Columba eventually became Scottish Presbyterians. You remember the video where they were talking about the Anglicans in Scotland, or the Church of England folk in Scotland became Anglicans. Well, the others, those were founded by Columba, became Scottish Presbyterians. So, like I say, things are moving around in all of those isles. But because of that, the English Channel, there wasn't as much movement between England and the mainland. And so England, or Britain, kept its own characteristics, religious characteristics, for a while. Questions? I know I'm
No.
going fast, furious. All right. So now we're up to the 7th century, when Christians really sort of take control of Britain. And this had to do with sort of the legalization stuff. So there was another guy, there's Augustine of Hippo, the way that scholars differentiate between these two people. There was Saint Augustine of Hippo, who wrote City of God and the Confessions and was such a huge theologian. He was in North Africa. There was another gentleman by the name of Augustine. He was a Benedictine monk, and he was he became the first Archbishop of Canterbury. So here the English Church really begins to take hold. Now we have an Archbishop, and he baptized King Ethelbert, who had a Christian wife, so he was sort of semi-connected. but he baptized Ethelbert, who had been a pagan and was the king. And so now we've got this English church really gaining legitimacy. And Gregory, who was Gregory the Great, who was the Pope at that time, authorized Augustine to develop liturgy and other practices, especially for the English-speaking people. And so here we've got this English church that's, Augustine is drawing from a lot of different things, and he's developing this English church practice that's happening as the Roman church practices are happening continentally. So England is its own thing, and it was given permission to be its own thing by Pope Gregory the Great. In 632, a monk named Aidan, also a bishop, goes to Lindisfarne and begins missionary work in Northumbria, up in the upper part of Britain, battling the pagans there. And he establishes a monastery on the island of Lindisfarne, which becomes known as the Holy Island. Still there, many Christians, especially Anglicans, make pilgrimages to Lindisfarne. If you go on pilgrimage to Britain, you'll go to London and Canterbury Cathedral, and most people want to go to Lindisfarne for that reason. And then in 663 or 664, we have what was known as the Synod of Whitby. Whitby was a mixed sex monastery, and this was one of these characteristics of the monastic orders in Britain, is that you would have a mixed sex monastery where one wing of the monastery would be men and the other wing of the monastery would be women. It's never happened on the continent. It was only in Britain. And they might come together for worship, but basically they lived separate lives and were ruled by one abbot, who might have then people underneath him who would work with the men's group and with the women group. But so Whitby Abbey became a site for meetings, and there was this famous synod or a council at Whitby in 663, 664. And what was decided is that because the practices on the mainland and the practices in Britain were different, that the British church would conform to the English practices. So that meant Easter and all sorts of other things. So here we have, after 300 years of the British church looking like its own self, they eventually lost to the Romans in terms of practices and things like that, how they calculate Easter. Not to say everything went away, but it lost some of its very significant, what's the word I'm looking for? Its character, I guess, its distinctive character. So there are still obviously practices in the English church and in the Episcopal church that don't look like the Roman Catholic Church, regardless of what happened in the Reformation. But we'll get to that a little bit more. So this was, at this point, the English church is the English church. It just is conforming in terms of worship and doctrine to the Roman Catholicism at that point, or Catholicism in general, because the Western Church or Catholicism and the Orthodox, they hadn't split. They were still kind of all doing the same stuff with some regional variations. So, questions? No.
No?
No.
Okay. So then we get into the medieval period. Just think about your European history. At the beginning of the 8th century, so here we're talking about people mostly. This fellow by the name of Bede was a historian and is known as one of the doctors of the church. Now, there are not a lot of doctors of the church in Roman Catholicism, maybe 7 or 8, I forget. But he is one. He's called the Venerable Bede, and he wrote a book called The Ecclesiastical History of the English People. And it's that history that I've been referring to. I mean, that's where we get all of this information about all of this stuff that had gone on up to this point in the English church. It's a fascinating read. You can find it. It's a great book, even if you're not a big history buff. But it was his book that helped define the way that we did dating. And I don't mean going out on a date, but how do we calculate dates? And it's actually in Bede's book, the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, that we got the phrase Anno Domini, in the year of the Lord. That's Bede. So very, very influential historian. He was not a priest, but an influential historian of the English church. And there are St. Bede's churches. You can find St. Bede churches around the country. I think there's one I don't know if there's one in Colorado or not. Can't remember. Fast forward another 60 years, we run across this guy named Alcuin. He was an agent of Charlemagne. Okay, he was an English deacon. And he became the abbot of the monastery in Tours in France. But he introduced a prayer that you hear every Sunday morning. Almighty God, unto whom all hearts are open, all desires known, and from whom no secrets are hid, cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration. He wrote that prayer. So that prayer that we're using in 2022, Alcuin wrote 1400 years ago.
Wow.
So the prayer book has some significantly long history to it. He also organized the copying of manuscripts. So Alcuin was known as a great scholar. Well, Charlemagne becomes emperor and sets the precedent for what an English king looks like. Just to just sort of show where Charlemagne sort of fits in this whole thing. I don't think he had much to do with the English church, but now an English king knows what's going to happen. Few years, 871, Alfred the Great becomes the king of the West Saxons. So by this time, the Anglo-Saxons had become thoroughly, part of all of Britain, right? So you've got the Anglo-Saxons. Well, you got the Saxons there, and Alfred becomes the king of the West Saxons and starts to unite the English people. So you still got tribes and all this other kind of stuff going on all through Britain. And it's Alfred the Great who starts uniting them. He allows the Vikings to settle in England as well. Then in 973, Dunstan, he was the Archbishop of Canterbury. He crowned Edgar, or Edward, as the king of all of England. So England had become united under one king who had been crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury. So this linkage of church and state is, goes back a long ways. It goes back pre Anglicanism or Church of England. It was certainly happening in Europe, but here we've got it happening in Great Britain, and that was Dunstan who did that. And the last guy, and I'm just gonna, he's on here for two reasons. Alphege. He was probably the next Archbishop of Canterbury. No, a few archbishops down. He was martyred in Greenwich or Greenwich, where the Greenwich Mean Time. He was martyred there by the Vikings. Even though one of his predecessors allowed the Vikings in, there was still some sort of bad blood, and he was martyred by them. And they were holding him hostage, was what was going on. And they wanted some ransom, and they liked him. They had nothing against him. They liked him. But he started preaching while they were partying, and they took offense at that and killed him. and well, Anglicans party, but Alfred, part of the reason that I like talking about Alfred, for two reasons. He was the story about Alfred is that he was beaten to death by the jaw with these guys holding jaw bones, and so he was beaten to death by bones. And I was ordained a priest on the feast day of Saint Alphege, and I remember the guy who was preaching my ordination sermon saying that Alphege was boned to death as opposed to stoned to death. So I have a tender place in my heart for Alphege, but England is united as a Christian nation, but that doesn't mean that everything is still absolutely wonderful. So part one of the medieval period. Any questions at this point?
No, that was really cool how you're talking about the 1796, that our prayers originate all the way from there,
Yeah.
It's cool.
Yeah, there's a book I keep wishing that I had bought. I don't know, I think it's out of print. But that's on the collects. It's on all of the prayers that are in the prayer book. And there's also a commentary. I have it in my office, a commentary on the prayer book. It's a big, thick volume. It's probably 1.5 inches to 2 inches thick, that gives the historical background of all of the collects that we use week by week. Some of them are more modern than others. Some of them have been modernized. But the one that we'll be using this coming week, Stir Up Your Church, O Lord, known as Stir Up Sunday. That one goes back quite a long ways. And then there was a one that we used several weeks ago that in Old English language said, prevent and follow your church, because prevent meant go before. But we think of prevent as meaning stop. So we had to change that, and grant that your spirit may always proceed and follow your church, or something like that is how we've changed that. So a lot of those prayers are really ancient, and some of them are not quite so ancient. But yeah, there's quite a bit of history in the prayer book, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about worship, certainly. Well, 1066, we get the Battle of Hastings. Anybody remember what that was all about?
Nope.
No.
William the Conqueror becomes king. The Normans come in, from Gaul, and come in and conquer Britain. And William the Conqueror becomes king at the Battle of Hastings, or subsequent to the Battle of Hastings. But that was where the Normans beat the Britons. And so we've got more people coming into the island. And if you go to Britain, you'll see churches that are called the Norman style, and they'll distinguish them between the other architecture of churches. And they'll say, well, this is a Norman church, this is a pre-Norman church, this is a Gothic church. But Norman was its own sort of architecture. A few years later, Margaret, an English princess, marries Malcolm. So here's an English princess marrying Malcolm, who was the King of Scotland. So now we've got Scotland and England becoming connected through marriage. And she leads a revival of piety in Scotland. So St. Margaret's, there are churches named for St. Margaret. When I was in seminary, there was an institution connected to the seminary And I think it dated back to the days when seminaries were only for men. And if there were women who wanted to study, they weren't part of the seminary, they were just kind of connected to it. And the connection where I went to seminary was called St. Margaret's House. So, this goes back 1,200 years to Margaret going to Scotland. In 1080, William, the Conqueror, reminds the Bishop of Rome. Okay, so William has conquered Britain and reminds the Bishop of Rome that the King of England owes him, the Pope, no allegiance. So here we start to get, this history of Britain sort of doing what it was doing and the continent doing what it was doing. The Normans come in and conquer Britain, and then they tell Rome, really, you don't control us. You're not the boss of me, right? and so you begin to hear the seeds of British discontent with sort of European control. And we'll certainly see more of that as we move along. Well, then we get Anselm of Canterbury becomes Archbishop. He was a very, very influential theologian and developed a particular argument for the existence of God. It's known as the ontological argument. Not going to go there, but when you talk about arguments for the existence of God, Anselm was one of the folks who developed that, and he was again Archbishop of Canterbury. 1161, Thomas of Becket. How many of you have heard of Becket?
I have.
Yeah. So he was a low-born guy, clean living best friend of King Henry II, and he became Archbishop of Canterbury in 1161. That turned sour, of course, and he was murdered in the cathedral. So that story of murder in the cathedral is about Becket, because he became inconvenient. He was killed by 4 knights in Canterbury Cathedral, and very quickly became regarded as a saint and miracle worker. And so he was buried in Canterbury Cathedral, and because of his holiness and all of this stuff, all of his renown, Canterbury Cathedral became the site of pilgrimage. And that site of pilgrimage became the subject of Canterbury Tales.
Oh.
So that's why all of those folks were going to Canterbury. They were going to Canterbury to the tomb of Thomas of Becket.
Oh, okay.
So all of these things, there are all this literature stuff sort of feeds into this too. Why were they going to Canterbury? These were pilgrims. What was going on? Well, then we get to the early part of the 13th century, and there was the Bishop of Rome, I can't remember who it was at this point, appointed a certain bishop to be the Archbishop of Canterbury, but King John, Robin Hood's King John, right? King John wouldn't let this guy enter England. Again, the British didn't want Rome ruling them, right? And so Rome's trying to send this guy to come in and be the Archbishop of Canterbury. John wouldn't let him in. So what does the Bishop of Rome do? It places Britain under interdict. Now, interdict is a punishment, I guess, or a way of putting pressure on a people. So you all know what excommunication is, right?
Yes.
Okay, it means that you cannot take communion. All right. And if you believe that you have to have communion, or if you have to have access to the sacraments to go to heaven, being excommunicated is a real problem. Well, interdict is kind of the national equivalent to excommunication. The Pope theoretically can forbid his clergy from offering the sacraments. So that means the whole people can't take communion, can't be buried, can't get married, all of this kind of stuff, which means that the people are going to get pretty pissed off at this political game that the king is playing with the Bishop of Rome.
Yep.
And so, finally, King John resigned his kingship to the bishop and then received it back. He became a Roman legate, and the interdict ended. And then Parliament then declared that John resigned illegally. And then he was, the English said, "Oh no, you're king again." I mean, there's all of this political stuff going on back and forth between Britain and Rome. 1215, John is forced to sign the Magna Carta. Again, the people want control, right? And so all of this stuff is going on in the early part of the second millennium here. And it's just, sort of fascinating stuff, because we've heard a lot about it, but most of us have never heard it in the context of what's going on in the life of the church. We hear about it as a historical event, the signing of the Magna Carta, big deal. It's a big deal. Or we've seen murder in the cathedral. Okay, well, you mean this is what was going on? So now we're up through the Magna Carta. And questions? Okay. Oops. All right.
No.
Part 3 of the medieval period. We will get up to about the Reformation. We won't get any further. So all of this stuff is going on. Magna Carta, about the same time, Francis of Assisi is founding the Franciscan order in the early part of the 13th century. In 1220, so a little later, Salisbury Cathedral, and that's what's there on the left, was begun. Cathedrals took 100 years to build. Salisbury Cathedral had, and the main reason that I'm putting it in here, is it had a sort of an outsized influence on the development of English church liturgy. And the way that the liturgy was developed at Salisbury Cathedral, or in Latin, Sarum, S-A-R-U-M, that liturgy became the model for what later became the Book of Common Prayer. So there were different liturgies around Britain in different order of things, but the one that was developed at Salisbury was what basically became our Book of Common Prayer. And so that was built in 1220, 1,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 800 years ago. It's astonishing to think how long, and that its influence goes on. Well, about the same time that's built, the Dominican order, Dominican monks arrive in Britain. A few years later, Franciscan monks arrive in Britain. Well, the Benedictines had been there for almost 1,000 years. And, so now we've got 3 different religious orders. I don't want to say vying for power, that's overstated, but you've got 3 different kind of religious groups, bodies, as well as just sort of the ongoing life of the church. So religious life in Britain was not uniform at all. And when you think about one of the things that I said yesterday in the sermon was that beliefs about Mary, like almost anything else in Anglicanism, sort of span the spectrum. And this goes back thousands of years in Britain, that there wasn't this real uniform way of thinking and believing. And so we see this with the Dominicans and the Franciscans arriving in a place that, at least monastically, the Benedictines had kind of had a lot of control over. But the Franciscans were really big on building local churches. And there are a lot of Franciscans represented, and Franciscan sort of ways of thinking in theology really much more underlies Anglican thinking than did the Dominicans. So their way of, because of the local church thing. So we've got there are Franciscan Episcopalians or Anglicans still. Roger Bacon invented the telescope, the microscope, and the thermometer. He became a Franciscan. So here's one of these, again, one of these names that you may have heard of in other places, but not necessarily in terms of church history. 1324, William of Ockham, English Franciscan. He had a particular philosophy that he had to defend at the Bishop of Rome court in Avignon. And his philosophy became nominalism. Have you ever heard of Occam's razor?
Yes,
Mhm.
Do you remember what it is?
no.
No.
That's okay. Yeah, I always have to remind myself, but it's, it's kind of like if there are three different answers to a question, it's usually the simplest one that should win. Don't make it complex. And so when you start applying that to theology, some theology is pretty complex, and Occam would argue, no, let's make it really simple. Let's go to the simplest answer. And that became problematic, but it also dominated European thought, theological thought, until the Reformation. So lots of stuff, again, going back and forth. Other people that may have heard of, Julian of Norwich in the 14th century. She had a series of mystical experiences and wrote of them in a book called The Revelations of Divine Love, and so is now a well-known mystical writer. You can find her stuff all over the place. Very popular in some circles. She wrote one of her famous lines, and she was writing during the plague, all right, during the Black Plague. And so she was really popular during the early part of the pandemic because everybody was wondering how somebody like Julian could sort of deal with the Black Plague. And her famous line in the Revelations of Divine Love was, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. This way of sort of looking past what was going on to say that everything will be well. Again, very, very significant medieval writer, and certainly is a writer. Not many women writers at that point. Certainly not many that whose writings we've been able to keep. 1381, John Wycliffe was a Bible translator, and that was a problem. You start translating the Bible out of Latin, and you get in trouble. And he was an Englishman and got in trouble and was martyred for his presumption to take the Bible out of Latin. A few years later, Chaucer, again, Canterbury Tales. You know about Chaucer. He began them in 1386. 1436, another woman writer, Marjorie Kemp, dictated her autobiography. She was considered pretty wacky. She was an eccentric, she might have been bipolar. There were instances that would show that she might go into an sort of ecstatic trance and then come out and be sort of uncontrollable. And so, but she dictated her biography and it became a spiritual classic. I don't think anybody calls her Saint Marjorie, not like Saint Julian of Norwich, but certainly woman writer of the 15th century, influential. 1485, War of the Roses, Civil War, and the Plantagenets in York, and all of those folks. You've heard of these people, and Lancaster. You've heard of all this. This is all. It ends with the victory of Henry VII, the first of the House of Tudor. So I have a cat that's all of a sudden wanting my attention. Ignore that animal under the desk. So now we've come up to Tudor, to Henry, to the Tudor family, after the Plantagenets and York and Lancaster and all of that kind of stuff. That Civil War, that particular Civil War. So that we're up to about 1,500 here. The next real piece that we would want to go into is really into the Reformation. So I'm going to stop this point this evening and just see if there are any thoughts, questions, reactions, comments. You know, this is you'll get another take on all of this in the two chapters, the chapter in the book and then the article. So by the time we come back next week, you'll have some more grist for the mill that you can bring to bear. But any questions at this point? Thoughts?
Gary, is there any way, and I don't know, I haven't looked at the book, but a lot of these people really fascinate me. Is there a list or a book, or could we have copies of the slides and look up anyway the different religious figures?
Yeah, I'm gonna because we don't need these slides anymore. I'm gonna stop this share.
Okay.
And I see if I can open this guy up.
Yeah, I agree too, because this is really cool history. You know, I'm a history buff, so.
That's not what I'm looking for. Trying to, there is a, yeah, so there is, I'll show you this. There is in the documents, do you see this thing that says History of Anglicanism?
Yes.
Okay, so here are a lot of these names. They're in this document. Not all of them. But there is also, let me see if it's in because this doesn't have as much detail as I was. So here's the syllabus.
Mm-hmm.
If you go, so you see here for the schedule, December 5th, here's the reading for down on for the 12th, you'll see the reading for next time. Weber, that's the book, and then the handout. But above that, you see the data for December 5th.
Mm-hmm.
And underneath that, if you use an online version and you click on this justiceanglicanorg.resources.timeline, you'll see all of these periods listed there. Do you see all the blueprint?
Yes.
Okay. If you click on those, you'll get the expanded outline that I was working from.
Okay.
And you can see all of these figures and all of that, all of those, and you may remember the ones that we talked about. I'm more than happy to share the slides. I'm more than happy to post this to that file as well if you want to look at the slides.
That'd be great, Gary, if you
Okay.
could do that.
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, I'll go ahead and add that in, and you'll see it as week 1 slides or something like that.
Okay.
So I've tried to make as much of this available. You can also go, I didn't put the link in there, but you see here it says the Maple Anglican YouTube channel.
Uh-huh.
So if you were to just, let me see if I can do this here. I think it's still there. This is the channel where I got that, yeah, here we go. So here are a whole lot of videos. And what's the difference between an Anglican and an Episcopalian? You know, there are a lot of these things that you might just find fun to look at. I wasn't going to use a lot of them, but some of them is history and some of this other stuff. So I tried to give you a lot of resources that you could sort of go back to and look at it on your own.
Mm-hmm.
Get in addition to the stuff that we'll talk about. So if you look at any of those and a question arises, let's talk about it next week.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
That's great. Thank you for asking that, because it really reminded me that I wanted to say this stuff is here too.
Okay.
Just forgot. And also at the bottom of the syllabus, if you keep it on your screen, the Zoom link is on there as well. So
Oh, okay.
from that won't change all the way through January. It's the same Zoom link all the way through.
Okay. Well, good.
Anything else?
No, this is great, Gary. That's
That was
great
good.
information.
Yeah,
A lot
well,
of information.
it's a lot, like I
Yeah.
say, we just did 1500 years of history in a little less than an hour. And, I really like human history rather than dates and names, but
Mhm.
that's not how we got taught a lot of history. And some of those dates and some of those names, oh, I knew that when I took, Western civilization in college, and I'd forgotten what it was, all of those kinds of things. So, but also we don't necessarily think about them in terms of our history, our church history. So contextualizing, I think, helps bring it home in another way. And Jenna, we'll talk a little bit more about Presbyterianism and things like that as we move forward, because the way that the Anglican Church or the Church of England developed in the Reformation had to do with what was going on in Scotland, what was going on in the mainland, and where Britain wanted to situate itself between these two. So the Scottish Calvinists, which became the Presbyterians, that's part of our history in an interesting way that I think is useful for us to know. So we'll end up talking a little bit more about that. Yeah. Anything else? All right.
No, that was very good. Thank you.
Yes, thank
Gary?
you.
All right. And if anybody else wants to join in, tell them, we can join in. We can just send them back to this one and they can see what they, missed, and we can move forward. And I'll try and get in touch with the folks that I thought I was going to see tonight and see what happened. People change their mind, and that's fine. Or people have other things come up. So anyway,
Okay,
we'll see you soon. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Gary.
Gary.
thank you.
Take care. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.